Today, we lowered our policy rate by a further 25 basis points to 4.5%. This decision reflects three considerations. First, monetary policy is working to ease broad price pressures. Second, with the economy in excess supply and slack in the labor market, the economy has more room to grow without creating inflationary pressures. And third, as inflation gets closer to the 2% target, the risk that inflation comes in higher than expected has to be increasingly balanced against the risk that the economy and inflation could be weaker than expected. Aujourd'hui, on a abaissé.
Today, we lowered our policy interest rate a further 25 basis points to 4.5%. This decision reflects three key considerations. First, monetary policy is working to ease broad price pressures. Second, with the economy in excess supply and slack in the labor market, the economy has more room to grow without creating inflationary pressures. And third, as inflation gets closer to the 2% target, the risk that inflation comes in higher than expected has to be increasingly balanced against the risk that the economy and inflation could be weaker than expected.
Looking ahead, we expect inflation to moderate further, though progress over the next year will likely be uneven. This forecast reflects the opposing forces affecting inflation. The overall weakness in the economy is pulling inflation down. At the same time, price pressures in shelter and other services are holding inflation up. We are increasingly confident that the ingredients to bring inflation back to target are in place. But the push-pull of these opposing forces means the decline in inflation will likely be gradual, and there could be setbacks along the way. If inflation continues to ease broadly in line with our forecast, it is reasonable to expect further cuts in our policy rate. The timing will depend on how we see these opposing forces playing out. In other words, we will be taking our monetary policy decisions one at a time. Let me highlight some of the economic dynamics covered in today's monetary policy report. Economic growth in Canada has picked up, but remains weak relative to population growth. Household spending has been soft. Pent-up demand for things like new cars and travel is fading. And many families are setting aside more of their income for debt payments, leaving less money for discretionary spending. In the labor market, employment has continued to grow more slowly than the labor force. Job seekers are now taking longer to find work, and the unemployment rate has risen to 6.4%. The job vacancy rate has come down significantly, and reports of labor shortages are now below normal. Overall, indicators suggest some slack in the labor market. Wage growth is also showing signs of moderating, although it remains elevated. Looking ahead, economic growth is expected to increase in the second half of 2024 and through 2025. This reflects stronger exports and a recovery in household spending as borrowing costs ease. Business investment is also expected to strengthen as demand picks up, and residential investment is forecast to grow robustly. Overall, with the economy strengthening, excess supply will be absorbed next year and into 2026. CPI inflation moderated to 2.7% in June after increasing in May, and broad inflationary pressures continue to ease. The bank's preferred measures of core inflation have now been below 3% for several months, and the breadth of price increases across components of the CPI is near its historic. Corporate pricing behavior has largely normalized, and near-term inflation expectations have come down, although they're still above normal. However, shelter price inflation remains high. Inflationary pressures are also evident in services that are closely affected by wages, such as restaurants and personal care. The bank's preferred measures of core inflation are expected to slow to about 2.5% in the second half of 2024 and ease further in 2025. CPI inflation is forecast to come down below core this fall and settle sustainably around the 2% target next year. But it's unlikely to proceed in a straight line. As always, there are risks around our inflation outlook. Globally, geopolitical uncertainty is high. Here in Canada, the biggest downside risk is that household spending could be weaker than expected. On the upside, inflation in shelter and other services could prove more persistent. So let me conclude. Comme les pressions généralisées sur les prix, la cible de 2%.
With broad price pressures continuing to ease and inflation expected to move closer to the 2% target, Governor Council decided to reduce the policy interest rate by a further 25 basis points. In recent months, we have continued to make progress bringing inflation down. But now, with the target in sight and more excess supply in the economy, the downside risks are taking on increased weight in our monetary policy deliberations. We need growth to pick up so that inflation does not fall too much.
Governing Council decided to reduce the policy interest rate by a further 25 basis points. In recent months, we have continued to make progress bring inflation down. Target in sight and more excess supply in the economy, downside risks are taking on increased weight in our monetary policy deliberations. We need growth to pick up so inflation does not fall too much, even as we work to get inflation down to the 2% target. We are carefully assessing the downward pull on inflation from ongoing excess supply and the pressures from shelter and other services that are holding inflation up. Monetary policy decisions will be guided by incoming information and our assessment of their implications for the inflation outlook. The bank remains resolute in its commitment to restoring price stability for Canadians.